Welcome. Thank you for watching this teaching video from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. Please check out our other videos and don't forget to like and subscribe. Our mission is to help people come to know Jesus better and love Him more every day. We believe this will not only help our own spiritual growth, but also help us better influence the community and the world for Christ. For more information about Oak Tree, please visit us at oaktreechurch.com. There you'll find past message series, online giving options, and more information about our discipleship process that we call The Path. Now enjoy this message. We'd love to hear from you in the comments or the website contact form. Thank you.
Well, we're spending the year, this whole year, 2025, which is now more than halfway gone. I know. We're spending the year focusing, examining, studying our spiritual growth process. Everyone who knows Jesus as Savior is in a spiritual growth process. Like Gary just said, we're at different levels, we're at different places, we move faster at some points, we move slower at some points. What we're finding in Hebrews is that sometimes we stop altogether, and that's not a good thing because then we actually start to slide backward. But we're all going through this process trying to know Jesus better, love Him more every day, right? We're not planning an entire lifetime. We're looking at a day at a time. If we can be closer just one day at a time, then we're on the right path. And that's what we call it here, is the path. And it's just the spiritual growth process that Peter outlined for us in 2 Peter chapter 1. And we've been teaching it that way here at Oak Tree for more than 10 years. Okay, we have the little booklet out there for free that you can grab, and I've reminded those of you who are here every week and or online, I've reminded you many, many times over this year now, if you haven't read The Path recently, you're due, okay? Make sure you grab a copy, make sure you read it. It's not long, and it's a good reminder. If you've never read it, then you're well overdue, but we want to be reminded of the process that God has laid out for us and designed for us, right? And so we're spending the year with doing a focused, intensive thought and study on that process. And we're using the seasons to help us think through it and parallel through it. And we are in summer, if you haven't noticed. And I've heard that this week it's supposed to especially be summer-like, right? It's going to be hot. Are we going to get rain? I don't know, but it's, possibly overbearing. Well, in the summer, if you're doing a garden, you're starting to get some crops. You got flowers all over the place. Maybe you have a few summer crops coming in. Some of our summer this year already has been just super hot, sweltering, right? You're looking at your grass and you're like, you might, at least for me, I'm looking at my grass in my yard. I'm like, I'm not wasting water on you. You are a lost cause. Sorry. See you next year. It's just like so hot. It's just, you're just trying to survive, right? And that's the key. That's the key that connects us between physical summer and spiritual summer. It's the last thing we want to do in our spiritual lives is just try to survive. Because God has given us everything we need for a godly lifestyle, for like life, so that we can actually thrive in this life, and we don't always do it, right? Sometimes we go through spiritual summers where everything seems like it's against us, where it's beating down on us, and we can barely take a step, right? And it feels like we're just barely surviving. It can be a harsh period, a hot period in our spiritual lives, possibly even to the point where we go into a drought. Now, here's the thing about droughts. When you're talking about your garden or your lawn or whatever at home, there's nothing you can do about that. It rains or it doesn't. I mean, you can water it, whatever, but it's not the same thing as when we have a good rain, right? Spiritual droughts are something that we do to ourselves, right? A spiritual drought is when we stop listening to God, when we stop reading the Bible, when we stop praying, when we stop that connection, and we actually create our own little drought, okay? And in fact, there's some pruning that God can do, some cutting as well, but where we're at, I want to skip a slide here for a second. These warnings that we've been doing that we've been studying in the book of Hebrews, this is exactly the type of drought conditions that I'm talking about. When we neglect the truth, when we neglect the Bible, when we neglect our spiritual growth process, we start to drift, don't we? We drift and drift and drift and drift away. And we can drift so far that we get into an attitude of unbelief and we start to disobey. It's not that we started with disobedience, we started with a drought. And it became disobedience and it became unbelief, and we can start to forsake God or start to fall away from God. And if we don't correct that, then last week we saw warning 3, where we can actually go into a state of spiritual apathy, where we just don't care anymore. We didn't start out there. We didn't start out not caring. We started out neglecting, which caused us to drift, which put us into a period of forsaking, and now we just don't care. And we actually start rejecting the truth that we know. We start rejecting Jesus himself, and it leads us to disqualification from ministry, possibly, or even we learned that God sometimes will take people's lives. Christians who were doing well, and they neglected and then disobeyed and then became apathetic and rejecting, and it's just like they slid way far away from God. The first word sets it all up. If we stay attentive to our spiritual growth process, we won't always grow like we want to. We won't always be fast. We won't always be as strong as we would like. But if we don't neglect our spiritual growth process, then we don't drift. And if we don't drift, then the rest of this doesn't happen either. Okay, it builds on itself. All right. That's why we're in the book of Hebrews, because the book of Hebrews is all about these 2 steps on the discipleship, on the growth path of perseverance and godliness. And perseverance is when we choose to trust God in every test, temptation, or trial. Or let me put it this way, when we choose to trust God in the summer. Right? In the spiritual summer, when everything is against us, everything is beating down on us. Doesn't matter where it comes from. It doesn't matter whether it's heavy or light. It doesn't matter, how bad it gets. It doesn't matter if someone else has it better or someone else has it worse. When you are going through a period of spiritual summer, that's the time that we need to persevere. That's the time that we need to lean into God stronger than ever before, right? That's perseverance. And when we do that, then we actually get a clearer picture of who God is. That's why we sing the songs that we do here, because I want them to stick in your mind throughout the week, these characteristics about God, so that as you're leaning into God, as you're persevering, as you're trusting, you start to say, aha, this is an area. Part of the reason that it's so difficult is because I need to align this with God a little bit better. I need to become more like him. Remember, God's plan for us is to become as much like Jesus in this life as we possibly can. Okay? I think part of it's so that it's not a culture shock when we get to heaven. We die, we go to heaven, it's just like, boom, whoa, okay, this is not what I was expecting. God doesn't want that for us. He wants us to have that as much as possible now. Okay, one old scholar, one old teacher, he said, earth is basically just a dress rehearsal for heaven. Okay, we want to get it right here as much as possible so that when we're there, we can fully appreciate and fully engage. And so godliness is the step where we are intentionally aligning ourselves. Okay? It's not just obeying, it's not just trying, it's not just persevering. Now it's like, okay, all right, I see Here's a thought pattern. Here's a worldview. Here's a character trait. Here's something that needs to align with Jesus, and then we are able to take that step and line up with Jesus. Okay. So the writer of Hebrews, as we've been going through this, has been working back and forth. We're in toward the end of chapter 6 today. Has been going back and forth between teaching about Jesus. Here's something that you need to know about Jesus, and now here's a warning if you forget that. And then there's always an encouragement after the warning. And now let me teach you something new about Jesus, and then a warning, and then encouragement. And we've done this 3 times now. Right? As we've gone through these first 3 warning passages. So, what we're doing today is we're coming back now to this part about, let me teach you something about Jesus. Okay? And this is actually, we're entering the longest section of the book of Hebrews. Okay? Sometimes a section has been 1 chapter or maybe a few verses, or the longest one was almost 2 chapters, right? This is basically going to be 4 chapters, so buckle in, okay? No, we're not doing it all today. We'll do it over the next few weeks together, okay? And this is why I mentioned right at the outset this morning is that these next few weeks, they really build on each other and fit together like a puzzle. So taking just one of these weeks on its own will have some good stuff, definitely. But really, these next 4 weeks or so really fit together beautifully because the writer is bringing us along up to a certain point, okay? So what we'd like, what I'd like to do today is basically we'll finish chapter 6 and do most of chapter 7, because again, it's not like we have to deal with every word of every verse, because he's doing some big picture thinking here, big picture thinking. So we're seeing it in chunks, okay? So this will take us now through most of the way through chapter 10, and the end of chapter 10 is going to be our 4th warning, and I'm telling you, that'll be a few weeks away, but that one is huge. That one is like, you could potentially walk away from that message at the end of chapter 10 thinking there's no hope. That's obviously not how we want you to leave church. We want you to leave convicted maybe, yes, but also encouraged, but that one's tough. That one's tough, okay? So just, I'm telling you, weeks in advance, prepare for that one. So let me give you a big picture overview over the next 4 chapters. The writer's picking up the theme of Jesus is our high priest. He's the one who's ministering on our behalf. He's interceding for us because the theme of Hebrews is Jesus is better than anyone or anything. Jesus is better than anyone or anything, right? All right, so here's a big picture. What are some of the ways over the next few chapters? Jesus' priesthood specifically is better. He offers a better hope. We'll see that today. He offers a better covenant. We'll see that, we'll just very briefly see that today, but that's really a lot of what next week is about. Better ministry, better promises, better tabernacle, or the word tabernacle just means tent, and that's what Moses and the Israelite people had before King Solomon built the temple, okay, basically the place of worship, the place of sacrifice. Jesus has a better one of those, and he offers a better redemption in chapter 9 there, okay? So a lot of stuff. We're not going to hit every little detail. Like I said, the writer is not, this is not like the book of Proverbs. It's not like every verse stands on its own. This is chunks, okay? This is the section, I mentioned this a few weeks ago. The writer referred to this, we call it the book of Hebrews. Whoever wrote this referred to this as a brief sermon. The whole book of Hebrews is a brief sermon, okay? That's how he referred to it himself. He's like, please excuse my brief sermon. And then he did a little sermon inside of a sermon or whatever. Basically, this is, and if you've been around here long enough, you know sometimes I'll get on something and I'll just keep going, right? I just don't breathe anymore, and I'm just like, right? That's this section. Okay? This guy is going to start, and he's not going to let off the gas for the next 4 chapters. All right? So we have to take it in chunks. This is one of those places where if you dial down too closely into the text, we're going to do this word for word, verse for verse, you actually miss the forest for the trees. Okay? You have to take this section in big chunks in order to see what's going on. Okay? So, here we go. Just by way of reminder, the original audience, Jewish people, probably in Rome, starting to face persecution. Nero was the emperor, and he was crazy. Anyway, just in general, he was crazy. But then he got this thing where he wanted to persecute the Christians. The Christians were causing all the trouble. He hated the Christians, got to take care of the Christians. Okay? So he banished some Christians, he killed some Christians, he persecuted Christians, and these were Jewish people who had believed in Jesus as their Messiah, as their Savior. They were Jewish Christians in Rome, and instead of leaving, they thought, well, he's not persecuting the Jews, and we're Jews. So I don't want to leave my home. I don't want to, this big mess. Tell you what we're going to do is I'm just going to pretend I'm not a Christian. Just going to pretend. I know I can't lose my salvation. I know it doesn't have any long-term lasting effect. I'm not going to go to hell if I pretend I'm not a Christian. So I'm going to pretend I'm not a Christian. I'm going to very quietly back away from the church and go back to the synagogue with my Jewish friends. I'm going to hang out. I'll follow the old Jewish stuff that I used to follow all the time before I believed in Jesus. And I'm going to hide the fact that I'm a Christian. And that's why these warnings are so important, especially that last warning. You end up rejecting Jesus because when you go back to your old way of life, you're telling those people, and this was something that came up in second hour as a big discussion point last week, when you go back to your old way of life, whether you're a Jew or not, just even today, you're telling those people, yeah, I tried Jesus and it didn't work. I tried Christianity, didn't work. Jesus was not the answer that I thought he was, and so I'm coming back. Right? It's actually a rejection of Jesus. Well, I'm not going to reject him. I'm just going to pretend. You got to be careful. Be very careful. And that's where he's picking up now with this section. If we consider going anywhere else to find fulfillment in our lives, we lose everything. We lose everything. All right, quick heads up, and then we'll get into it. This section, and I'm talking the whole section, like through, definitely through chapter 9 into chapter 10 a little bit. This section requires a pretty decent grasp of the Old Testament. So go ahead and take a couple of minutes and just read the Old Testament. Make sure you're caught up on that. Especially the sacrificial system. Okay, so let me give you a quick background. God set up this system. It was their civil law. It wasn't just about sin. It was just the whole law. It was like the Constitution of Israel. These are the laws of the land. Okay? And if you break one of the laws, whether it was a moral thing, it was like a really sin, whether it was just, forgot to do something, or all sorts of things I don't want to get into. There's 613 of these commands. Stuff that, there are certain things that you can't even, do yourself. You can't even control it. There's bodily functions and stuff, and God says, well, but that makes you ceremonially unclean, so you have to offer a sacrifice, or you have to wait, or whatever, okay? So it wasn't always about sin, but God set up this whole thing because they needed a law code. And in that system, the nation of Israel was divided into 12 clans or 12 tribes based on the 12 sons of Jacob. Okay? It's a family thing, all right? And this is all in the Old Testament. One of those sons was named Levi. His clan, his tribe were the Levites, okay? And God selected that particular family to be the mediators between the rest of Israel and God. They would be the priests, they would be the ministers in the temple or in the tabernacle. They would be the ones who did the ministry, and everybody else just kept on doing their jobs and working and everything. And they would be the ones that would help mediate. Okay, so when it talks about Levi and the Levitical system, and in fact, the third book of the Bible is Leviticus. That's all where it came. It's all where it comes from. Okay, it's the whole thing. It's just talking about the old system. All right. You have to know that, all right? Second hour is a great place to dig into some of that later if you want. Now, back in chapter 5, God promised, I'm going to make Jesus, the Messiah, a priest. But he's not going to follow that old system. He's actually going to follow a pattern of a guy by the name of Melchizedek, okay? Melchizedek, and this will have to come up with him. Chapter 6, verse 13. Now, when God made his promise to Abraham, you're going to have a son, you're going to be a great nation. Since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself. I love this verse, okay? Because I'm a visual person. So, you've got, Perry Mason, or you've got these cop shows, and you're in the courtroom or whatever, and, place your hand, raise your hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but yourself, but the truth? So help you. There it is. So help you God. Even in our secular court system, sometimes it's so help me God, right? God can't say that. Since he could swear by no one greater. We swear by someone or something greater than us. And God's like, so help me. So help me. There's nothing else. Okay? He swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you greatly. I will multiply your descendants abundantly. And so by, what? Verse 15, so by persevering, there's our word. So by persevering, Abraham inherited the promise. Now watch this. By persevering, Abraham inherited the promise. The word perseverance, especially here in the New Testament, it means patience. It's the same word as patience, okay? Or waiting, depending on the context. So we've been talking about perseverance. Let's think through this a little bit. Sometimes perseverance means pushing forward. I just have to keep pushing, I can't stop, I just have to go. Persevere, right? You've been in situations where you just can't stop. Sometimes perseverance, in some contexts, in some situations, perseverance just means holding strong under pressure. It's not like you're falling back. You're still, you may be leaning into it, you may be pushing forward, but you're not actually advancing anything. You're just holding your ground. Okay? In Ephesians chapter 6, a famous passage for a lot of people. A lot of people like this passage in Ephesians 6 because it's about the armor of God, right? Put on the armor of God, right? Which really means to put on God himself and let him wear his armor, and we hide and we trust in him. So how do you know that? Because the armor of God, four times in that passage. It doesn't say go on the offensive. It doesn't say attack. It doesn't say rebuke. It doesn't have any action words that we would usually think of when it talks about armor. What it says is you put on the armor of God so that you may stand. 4 times it says stand or stand firm. It doesn't say advance, it doesn't say attack, it doesn't say keep pushing forward. Sometimes in the middle of the battle, the best thing to do is just stand firm. Just hold your ground. Because you're not making any progress at that point anyway. Sometimes perseverance means holding strong and waiting under the pressure. There was only so much that Abraham could do to fulfill this promise. God said, I'm going to give you a son, I'm going to make you into a great nation. What's Abraham going to do about that? Not much. A little bit. Not much. Not much. He had to wait. And in fact, Abraham was not alive when he when some of this great nation started to happen. He never actually saw it. Not on earth. He couldn't guarantee Sarah would become pregnant. He couldn't guarantee that they would have a son. He had no guarantees other than God's word, other than God's promise. No guarantees at all. But at 100 years old, he didn't stop trying. He didn't stop trying, right? He believed in God so much that he would not stop trying, even though he had no control, no power over any of it. He waited, he was patient, he held strong, and he did what he could, the little bit that he could, and that was it. And he trusted God to do the rest. That's what we're talking about here. Okay? That's what we're talking about. Verse 16, people swear by something greater than themselves. Okay, so that's the same thing. In the same way, God wanted to demonstrate more clearly to the heirs of the promise that his purpose was unchangeable. And we'll get into that more next week when we talk about the covenant, because that's not going to change. And so he intervened with an oath, so help me, so that we who have found refuge in him may find strong encouragement. Here it is, to hold fast to the hope set before us through two unchangeable things. Two unchangeable things. What are his unchangeable things? His promise and his oath. He made a promise, he swore by himself, and that can't change. Why? Because he can't change. God doesn't change. So two unchangeable things. It is impossible for God to lie. And the writer comes back to this hope. Hold fast to the hope, because we have this hope as, maybe if you grew up in church, you're familiar with this next phrase, an anchor for the soul. There's an old song that says, I have an anchor for the soul, right? It's Jesus himself. Jesus himself. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul. Sure, steadfast. Why do we need an anchor? Why do we need an anchor? So we don't drift. We talked about this several weeks ago in chapter 2, right? So now the writer is actually making this connection, bringing it back. If we neglect the truth, if we neglect our spiritual life, our spiritual progress, we start to drift away unless we're tied to something. And I said weeks ago, we need to stay tied to Jesus. We need to stay strong with him. Not neglect. And now the writer is bringing this back and actually uses the word anchor. If we're not anchored, we drift. He is an anchor for our soul. He's sure. He is steadfast. And it says, which reaches behind the curtain. This goes back into the Old Testament, because there was a curtain that separated God in the tabernacle and in the temple. There was a curtain that separated God from everyone else, including the priests, actually. And only the high priest on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, once a year, the high priest could go through that curtain and could actually make a sacrifice and an offering for the sins of the entire nation. That's the curtain that the writer is mentioning here. He actually, Jesus himself, when he went into heaven, he offered himself as the sacrifice directly before God. This was like an eternal Yom Kippur, an eternal Day of Atonement. Never have to do another one. Once for all people, for all time, it's done. That's why we see in chapter 1, when he made purification for sins, he sat down. He has nothing left to do. No more cleansing to be made, no more sacrifices, no more offerings. His work as the sacrificial part of his work is done. Now he has the ministering and interceding. Whereas Jesus, our forerunner, entered on our behalf to God, since he became, here it is, a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. We finally reached the story of Melchizedek. I mean, he's been ramping this up. He's been setting this up like this is going to be a big thing, right? I hope it's not too anticlimactic for you, because the entire story of Melchizedek is 3 verses. That's the whole thing. The whole thing. I can show you. It won't even take any time. I can just show you. In takes time for me to move my little windows around. In Genesis chapter 14, verses 18, 19, and 20. That's the whole thing, okay? Abraham has attacked 5 kings and won. He's got this little security detail of about 318 armed men, and he attacked 5 kings. He won. He's got all of this loot, and as he's on his way back home, he passes the city of Salem, better known as Jerusalem, okay, is what it came to be known as. And when he passed Salem or Jerusalem, this is what happened. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Like this is his introduction. Does it remind you of anything, bread and wine? Sort of like the Last Supper, right? The whole introduction to Melchizedek is he brought out bread and wine. I mean, you can look in your own Bible. We can scroll back. There's nothing in here. Abram returned from defeating Kedorlaomer, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom, went out to meet him in the valley, known as King's Valley. And then Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Here's the next thing we know about him. He's the priest of the Most High God. In the middle of nowhere, we have someone who knows God, who is serving as God as a priest, which also means that there are other people around who know and worship God. I mean, it's not like he's out there as a priest by himself, right? There are other people who know God, even in Abraham's day. And he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by the Most High God, creator of heaven and earth. Worthy of praise is the Most High God, who delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave Melchizedek 1/10 of everything. Hey, I've got a whole bunch of loot here that I just picked up north, and here, have some of it. Gave a 1/10 of his proceeds. That's it. That's the story of Melchizedek. There is more written about Melchizedek in Hebrews than there is in actually Melchizedek's story in Genesis. Okay? In fact, I have the stats for you because, we like those things, right? Here's the stat. His name shows up, twice here. Okay? 18, Melchizedek. At the end of verse 20, Melchizedek. Shows up one more time in Psalm 110, which is the most quoted psalm. There it is. I was going to say, I can't find it. You can't see it because I have to scroll a little bit. There it is. Psalm 110 is the most quoted psalm in the Bible. It's the most quoted psalm in Hebrews, okay? Partially because of this right here. Where God made this oath, he promised Messiah, and everybody recognizes Psalm 110 as a psalm about Messiah, okay? And here it says down in verse 4, the Lord makes this promise on oath and will not revoke it, right? I swear by, so help me, right? You are an eternal priest after the pattern of Melchizedek. Those three times are the only times Melchizedek's name shows up in the Old Testament or in the New Testament until the book of Hebrews. And over the next couple of chapters, we see his name 9 times. 3 times more just in Hebrews than in the rest of the Bible combined. Okay? So the writer of Hebrews really makes a big deal about this guy. But, I mean, that's, like I said, I hope it's not anticlimactic to you because that's the whole thing. It's the whole thing. Now, here's some fun facts about Melchizedek. Chapter 7, verse 1. Now, this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham as he was returning from defeating the kings and blessed him. We just read that. To him also Abraham apportioned a tithe of everything. He just quoted Genesis 14, like the whole 3-verse section. Now, check this out. His name first means king of righteousness. Okay? Melch, or Melech, or Melchi is king. Tzedek is righteousness. Literally, Melchizedek is king of righteousness. That's all it means, okay? Or that's what it means. But he's also the king of Salem. Now, we call it Jerusalem. Back then it was Salem. Salem is related to the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace, welfare, greetings, tidings. So he effectively is a king of righteousness and peace. Now, here's why that's cool, because you're just like, so what? Here's why that's cool. Because of all of the ways that the Old Testament describes the Messiah's kingdom, there are two characteristics that are above the rest of them. Messiah will rule in his kingdom in total, complete righteousness. He will be a king of righteousness. And all over the earth, he will rule a kingdom of peace. Messiah's kingdom, we'll call it the millennium. It's a 1,000-year reign still in the future. Messiah's kingdom will be characterized above all other things as a kingdom of peace and righteousness. And he is serving even right now, not as king. He's not reigning as king over the earth yet, but he is serving as priest, just like the priest of peace and righteousness. Jesus is serving that way now. You see how maybe the Bible ties together the whole thing? This isn't just a collection of, it is a collection, but it's not just a collection of unrelated things. We just went from Genesis 14 through Psalms, through the prophets, Isaiah 11 if you care, through the prophets, through the New Testament, to the book of Hebrews, which is almost all the way at the end, on just this one small topic. Just this one theme. How cool is that? God has a plan. He's working something out, and he's working towards something, and it's just very cool. So what happens basically here is that Melchizedek ends up foreshadowing Jesus. Okay, who Melchizedek was, what Melchizedek did, sets up what Jesus is doing in the future. So here's a couple of things. Verse 3, without father, without mother, without genealogy, he has neither beginning of days nor end of days, but is like the Son of God, and he remains a priest for all time. Now, the point is not that Melchizedek had a virgin conception and birth like Jesus did, that he did not have a father and mother, he just popped onto the scene. The point is that when you come to Genesis 14, you're reading along, Abraham is in the middle of the war and all this, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought in bread and wine. It's like, whoa, where did Melchizedek come from? You don't get to know. Who's his family? Not going to tell, right? That's the whole point, is he is foreshadowing Jesus. And I put my bullet points backwards. With no family history, I put my slides backwards. With no family history, Melchizedek is like a forever priest without beginning or end. Okay? We don't know when he started being a priest. We don't know anything about his birth, his family. We don't know anything about his death. When did he stop? We know nothing else except for those couple of verses in Genesis 14. But that's enough to foreshadow or to set up Jesus, who we know had an earthly beginning. He had an earthly death, but he resurrected, and because he can't die again, he's a priest forever. Melchizedek died. Okay, I assume he died. He's not walking around the planet today. Okay, nobody's met him, right? He died. He can't be a priest forever, but Jesus can. Jesus can never die again. He can never die. His priesthood will last forever. And he is our forever priest serving on our behalf. And I put this line in here, especially now when we are so weak and struggling with our faith. That's when we need him. Already a couple of times the book of Hebrews has told us we can come boldly and confidently to the throne of grace, right? Where we can find help when we need it. We've been told that Jesus was made just like us in every way except without sin. He's tempted like us, or he was tempted like us, except without sin, so that he can be the help that we need, right? That's the whole thing. Jesus' priesthood is better than any other priest that came before him. And he is the last one, and his priesthood never ends. He will always be there for us. He will always be there for us. Okay? Verse 4, see how great he must be if Abraham, the patriarch, gave him a tithe of his plunder. And then there's a paragraph here. I'm not going to read it. You can read it. There's a paragraph that just goes back and forth with the greater blesses the lesser, right? The one who is in a greater position blesses the one who is lower. The one who is lower receives a blessing from the greater and gives thanks. In this case, gives a tithe or gives some kind of offering to the one who is greater, okay? And the writer's whole point, just exalting Melchizedek's greatness, and then if Melchizedek is so great, Jesus is even better. He's like, listen, of all the people in the Old Testament, one of the greatest people is Abraham, right? The father of the Jewish nation, the covenant promises, the whole thing. Abraham is like one of the, like way up there people in Judaism, in the nation of Israel and everything, right? This guy who came out of nowhere blessed Abraham? Wow. I mean, I would expect it to be the other way around. This guy comes out and Abraham's like, I am a spokesman for God, I bless you. Abraham shows up and the king, Melchizedek, walks out and says, I have a word from God for you. It's like, whoa. This is Abraham who has lunch with Jesus. Right? This is the angel of the Lord and a couple of other angels. This is Jesus literally comes to Abraham's tent. Hey, can we have lunch? And there's this king who actually blesses Abraham. And Abraham makes an offering to God through this priest. It's unheard of. And Jesus is better than that. The writer is just trying to just give one example after another, okay? Because we think too small. We think too small, okay? Jesus will one day be king in Jerusalem. I already mentioned this. And is characterized by righteousness and peace, and that's Isaiah 11. Jesus is currently serving as our righteous and faithful high priest in heaven. Here's the big question. We'll see this in verse 11. Why? I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, Melchizedek was before Israel, Melchizedek, but God gave Israel this covenant. God gave Israel this law code. God gave Israel this system. And if God gave it, it should be perfect, right? Why? Here's the big question. Why, if the old covenant was good enough, why did Israel need a new one? We'll spend more time on that next week, okay? But he asks this question here in verse 11. So if perfection had in fact been possible through the Levitical priesthood, on what basis the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise? And not only that, but said to be in the order after the pattern of Melchizedek and not after the pattern of Aaron, who was the first high priest in that system. This isn't just Jesus is, the system didn't work quite right, so I'm going to fix the system. Jesus transcends the entire system. He says, I'm better than the whole thing. That whole thing was not meant to be permanent. The whole thing pointed to Jesus, and so he can't be part of a system which was intentionally imperfect. He has to transcend the whole thing. And so his pattern is actually this guy back in Genesis that most people have never heard of, instead of Aaron and the Levites and this thing that takes up most of the Old Testament. Okay? When the priesthood changes, a change in the law must come as well. There's a change in the law. Yet the one these things are spoken about belongs to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe has ever officiated at the altar, because it's clear that our Lord descended from Judah. Jesus is not even from the tribe of Levi. He's from the tribe of Judah. Okay? And no one was ever allowed to be a priest from that tribe. Okay? And so the writer spend some time talking about that. I want to jump to verse 17, okay, and finish up the chapter here. All right, Jesus is greater than all that. All right, here we go. 17. Here's the testimony about him. Comes back, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. On the one hand, a former command is set aside because it's weak and useless, because the law made nothing perfect. It was never the intention of the Old Testament law to make people perfect. It was always the intention to hold them until Jesus came. Romans chapter 3 says this. Galatians chapter 3 and 4 says this. The old covenant, the old system was never meant to be good enough. The problem is that entire generations of people built their lives as if it were good enough, and then they added on to it so that by Jesus' day, the religious system had created such a structure that if you went against their structure in any way, they just condemned you to hell. You can't even be part. I don't care where you're from. If you don't follow our thing, you're completely out. There are a lot of churches that do that same thing today. They build these religious structures, okay, around the gospel. I'm not talking about the gospel because, we do believe that. If you don't believe the gospel, you're out. You're not in. You're not part of God's family. You're not part of God's blessings. And if a person dies without believing in Jesus as Savior, as the only way to be right with God, we do believe that. There's an exclusivity here. If a person dies without believing in Jesus as Savior, God himself says that they are separated from him forever. In hell, in the lake of fire, forever. Not one of my favorite doctrines. I like to think about that. But that's what the Bible says, and it's true. But that's not a system of rules. It's not some thing where you have to be good enough. And that's where we as humans get in trouble, because we build systems of rules and say, if you don't match our rules, if you don't match our preferences, if you don't like the same things I like, if you don't, whatever, well, then I'm condemning you to hell. And God says, first of all, okay, your rules are stupid. Secondly, you don't get to do that. You don't get to condemn people to hell. Only God does that, and it's based on whether they believe in Jesus as Savior. That's it. Not if they're good, not if they're bad, not if they meet our, changing things. And the old covenant, the old system, the Moses and Aaron and all that stuff, it was never meant to be good enough. It was never meant to be good enough. God didn't give that to them to be good enough. God gave that to them to hold them for a couple of thousand years until Jesus came and could make everything right. We don't have to go back to that. We don't have to put ourselves under that old system or whatever, because Jesus took care of it. He fulfilled it. He's greater than all of that stuff. He's better than anything else. And you say, I probably wouldn't put myself under that anyway. I know that, but don't forget the original readers, the original audience, that's exactly what they were doing. We may not go back to that old system. What our temptation is to build other laws around us. Well, I'm going to go to this particular church. I'm going to follow this particular preacher. I'm going to follow these particular rules because Christianity is a spiritual thing and I need something tangible. I like this church over here because of the songs they sing, or I like this church over here because they do candles, or I like this over here. I listen to this preacher because he's, I don't like the way Daniel says this, and so I'm going to listen to this guy over here. That's fine, whatever, okay? But when we build our systems on our preferences, when we build our systems on our rules, when we build our systems on people, we're doing the exact same thing that they were doing back here 2,000 years ago. And we're going away from Jesus. And every time we do that, we lose. Every time we do that, we lose. Because Jesus is better. Better. He's enough, too. Jesus is enough. Yeah. Jesus is enough, and Jesus is better than anyone or anything else. And so it actually was intended to be weak and useless because the law made nothing perfect. On the other hand, a better hope is introduced. A better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. So let me give you 4 last things as we close this morning, because this has all been like Old Testament and history and all this stuff. I told you this fits together. Over the next several weeks, we'll keep building into this. Is basically the introduction for the next 4 weeks, okay? Let me give you 4 things that are better in the last part of chapter 7 here. The reminder with Jesus. Jesus' priesthood is better. Number 1, better hope, through which we draw near to God. We've talked about this. We can approach God confidently, boldly to the throne of grace, right? The end of chapter 4. Not because we're anything special, but because we have Jesus. And hope, by the way, and I've said this before, not everyone has heard me say this before. In the Bible, especially when connected to Jesus, hope is not just wishful thinking. Hope is something that we have confidence in, even though we have no, let's say, proof of it yet. Okay? I mean, we have God's promise, and yeah, Jesus died and was resurrected, but come on, that's 2,000 years ago. This story's been told for a long, long time. You haven't seen him. You didn't see him before he was resurrected. You are basing your faith off of the story that Jesus was resurrected. And a lot of people won't do that. They're like, well, that's a 2,000-year-old story. I can't trust that. That's where faith comes in. That's really where faith comes in. Is because even if you don't have eyewitness proof, okay, like they did back then, actually, even if you don't have eyewitness proof, you say, I believe that this is true. I believe that God is not lying I believe this is from God, and he's not lying to me. And I am placing not just my faith or my trust, but I'm placing my hope for the future is built on this thing that I can't see, but I believe it. Okay? Are there evidences in our lives? Yes, there's growth and all sorts of things, but there are a lot of good people in this world that want nothing to do with Jesus. Good lives don't prove anything. Good people don't prove anything. Okay? There's an internal growth that in a sense really only we know about. It's good works don't prove anything. Good lives don't prove anything. Jesus has a better hope through which we draw near to God. And since this was not done without a sworn affirmation, he comes back to this, so help me. Okay? The others became priests without sworn affirmation, but Jesus did so with a sworn affirmation by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. That's Psalm 110. Okay, accordingly, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. All right, now next week, again, chapter 8 is all about this, the new covenant that's coming in the future. But God went under oath, right? His promise and his oath, 2 unchangeable things. God went under oath. Usually, you'd think if God says something, you can trust it. Why does God need to swear by anything, right? But this is such an important thing that it's as if God held up his hand and said, I swear that this is true and it can never be changed. God went under oath to confirm his new covenant with Israel. We see that here. Accordingly, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. And the others who became priests were numerous, because death prevented them from continuing in office, right? Just attrition. But he holds his priesthood permanently since he lives forever. He's a better mediator. He's a better mediator because he will never die again. So, look at verse 25. He is able to save completely. He is able to save permanently those who come to God through him. Why? Not just because he is better, but because he'll never die. No one ever is going to have to pick up where he left off. It's not that he's writing, in your work, you write notes down so your successor can know how to do the job, right? Right? Jesus doesn't have to leave notes for anybody. Nobody's ever going to be his successor. From the moment you believed in him as Savior through eternity, he never forgets your name. Ever. For any reason. He's a better priest. He's a better mediator than anyone who has come before because he'll never die. And finally, we've already talked about the fact that he's a better man, but the fact that he's a better person, a better man, also makes him a better priest, interceding, mediating on our behalf. It is indeed fitting, verse 26 here, it is indeed fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separate from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need to do every day what those priests do, to offer sacrifices first for their own sins and then for the sins of the people, since he did this in offering himself once for all. The law appoints as high priests men subject to weakness, but the word of solemn affirmation that came after the law appoints a son made perfect forever. I don't know what you were expecting tucked away here in the middle of the book of Hebrews, but that was pretty cool, wasn't it? That was pretty cool. It may seem a little bit boring for us to sing holy 6 times or 8 times or whatever, but this is his chief characteristic, and that's one of the things he wants us to really get here as we become like him, so that we can join the saints and the angels forever, celebrating who he really is. And right now, he is living out that holiness as he ministers on our behalf, so that we're not just surviving the heat, so we're not just surviving the summer. We can actually thrive, even when everything around us is falling down, even when everyone around us is going through a drought. We don't have to. And it's not because we're awesome, and it's not because you're here at Oak Tree, although that helps. It's not because, any of that. It's all because of Jesus, right? It's all because of Jesus. He is better than anything and anyone. Why would we go anywhere else?